Towards the end of 1867, a two-part article appeared in a newspaper called The Examiner, devoted to the works of Foley. The author regretted that this was not a full-scale life story, such as he insisted should be written when the life has been one of unfaltering and unfailing struggle for fame through a long course of years, and when, from its commencement to its culminating point of honour and distinction, it has been checkered by none of those drawbacks which too often interrupt the progress to maturity of the ablest and most ambitious votaries of art. Some of you will know that the angle from which I come at Foley has been dictated to a degree by my long study of his rival, the Franco-Italian sculptor Carlo Marochetti. The Examiner articles appeared only a matter of weeks before Marochetti's death. Following his death, Foley was to step very publicly into Marochetti's shoes, receiving the commission to sculpt the central figure of Prince Albert for Sir George Gilbert Scott's National Memorial to the Prince for Kensington Gardens, a job on which Marochetti had failed to give satisfaction. Queen Victoria had tried to convince courtiers who were involved with the memorial that Marochetti was, in her words, the only sculptor, positively the only one in England, of really transcendental genius. End of quote. To the delight of some of those courtiers, the Queen was persuaded to eat her words, admitting that Marochetti had failed to produce the desired image of her beloved Albert, and in the end confessing that Foley had made a better job of it. By the time that Foley's statue was finally put into position, he had died. He died in 1874, as it was thought, a victim of his own admittedly enormous success in attracting commissions. Seldom can any sculptor have left so many projects unfinished. But it was another feature of Foley's good luck story that he had groomed enough able pupils to ensure that these were all completed in conformity to his wishes. So a massive, if ultimately suicidal success story. The Queen responded to the news of Foley's death in her inimitable way. Much shocked, she said, to hear of the death of Mr. Foley, the eminent sculptor, who was employed in making the statue of my beloved Albert, having been recommended to do so after Baron Marochetti's death. And now he is gone too. Fortunately, his model was completed, and the casting had commenced, so that the work can be proceeded with. But he is a great loss, and was one of our best sculptors, end of quotation. So, not a transcendental genius, but one of England's best. In saying this, she was in fact falling into line with Marochetti's own view of Foley's stature. In discussing with Earl Granville, who amongst British sculptors might be worthy of a commission to execute a statue for India, this is the expiatory monument over the well in Cawnpore, where a massacre occurred during the mutiny. Marochetti had told the Earl that Foley was the only British sculptor who could be relied on to do it. In his opinion, Foley was clever in composition and excellent in execution. All other British sculptors he dismissed as pitoyable, pitiful. It is likely that the emphasis put by the author of the Examiner articles on Foley's struggle for success should be read in the light of what all knew to be the likely career trajectory of an Irish sculptor attempting to establish a practice in London. Accounts of such careers in the early 19th century can be found in Strickland and in Paula Murphy's more recent sculpture volume in the Art and Architecture of Ireland series. These life stories enable us to form a picture of the predicament of those from the previous generation, which would certainly have warned Foley of what he might expect. The most likely prospect would have been a life spent in servitude to an established English sculptor, but with an occasional chance to stick his head above the parapet in works bearing his own name. This had been the fate of Lawrence and Sebastian Gagin, both employed by the notoriously miserly Joseph Nollekins, of Vincent Gagin and Thomas Carew, who did the same slavish work for Sir Richard Westmacott, and of Thomas Heffernan, who ended his life in poverty after devoting his best efforts to work going under the name of Sir Francis Chauntry. Chantry is supposed to have guaranteed Heffernan's continued services by making fraudulent promises of a bequest in his will. Vincent Gagan was even crushed to death when Westmacott's colossal statue of George Canning fell on him, leaving his wife and children destitute and dependent on charity from the Artist's General Benevolent Fund. Foley was preceded to London by his older brother, Edward Arlington Foley, who seems to have gone over to London in 1830 as a jobbing sculptor, and so impressed William Baines with his carving of a coat of arms that Baines took him on as a studio assistant. At least in a sense, Baines was part of the club. His father, a piano maker, was originally from Hanover, but had taken his son at an early age to Dublin. William Baines's career had started with drawing courses at the Royal Dublin Schools, although he later went on to practice his art in London. In fact, Baines was often described in the press as an Irish immigrant artist. When John Henry Foley followed his brother over to England, he also entered Baines's employ, but indicated higher ambitions by enrolling in the Royal Academy schools. As far back as 1933, an art historian, Eric Underwood, drew attention to the unusual variety of genres in Foley's early exhibits at the Royal Academy and elsewhere. They started with the biblical death of Abel before returning to the safer ground of sentimental allegory and innocence, a young girl clasping a dove to her breast. Then came a piece of sentimental genre in The Homeless Wanderer. More unusual were three subjects from Shakespeare: the death of King Lear in 1840, followed by Lear and Cordelia in 1841, and Prospero relating his adventures to Miranda in 1843. The Prospero and Miranda was shown again at the British Institution in 1844, when it elicited a rare mention in the Art Union magazine. A sketch, but one of rich promise. We trust to see so beautiful and touching a thought properly worked out. It is full of power and pathos. As in the case of Baines, I suspect that the preoccupation with Shakespeare, which didn't last very long in Foley's case, must have had to do with those links with the expatriate London Irish community. In the 1840s, he would sculpt two attractive portraits of the actress Helen Fawcett, one a bust, the other a relief of Fawcett seated with a large medallion portrait of Shakespeare at her side. Fawcett, not herself Irish, was a member of the Drury Lane theatre troupe, of which the Irishman William Charles Macready was the head. John Henry Foley was drawn into British history subjects later in commissions which called specifically for them. Almost perversely, he did not show one when such a subject seemed most called for. In 1844, the Royal Commissioners for the Fine Arts for the Palace of Westminster staged an exhibition in Westminster Hall with a view to finding suitable painters and sculptors to produce work for the new Houses of Parliament. On this occasion, his brother, Edward Arlington, made what clearly suggested itself an appropriate choice of subject, the subject from British history, showing a statue of King Canute, reproving his courtiers as the sea rises above his ankles, an example to all rulers not to trust to flattery. This subject was chosen by at least three other exhibitors amongst the people who showed at Westminster Hall. Such subjects from the British history, though not treated by all the Westminster Hall exhibitors, many of whom, in conformity with the entrance regulations, showed a work they were proud of from the previous 3 years. However, they were certainly in the majority. John Henry Foley decided to fly in the face of the mainstream, showing two subjects from classical mythology. One was the youth at the stream, representing the young Hermaphroditus before his transformation into a hermaphrodite, but still not exactly a toxically masculine specimen. The Art Union magazine stated the obvious in saying that the youth was not suited to the purposes of the exhibition. Nevertheless, its critic was bowled over with its beauty. This critic was bowled over by its beauty, saying that had such a figure been dug up in Rome or near Naples, it would have been pronounced a valuable specimen of classic art. When it came to the judgment of the commissioners, it was Edward Arlington's Canute which got nowhere, whilst John Henry's unsuitable sculpture won him the prize, and he would be selected, along with the Englishman John Bell and the Scotsman William Calder Marshall, to sculpt historical figures for the Palace of Westminster. No one, so far as I know, has ever speculated on whether this choice of an Englishman, an Irishman, and a Scot was made for its representativeness. No Welshman seems to have entered. Despite the Art Union's claim that Foley's youth could be taken for an antique work, it would, I think, be fair to claim that both it and the Ino and Bacchus have a somewhat attenuated and mannered grace, which belongs to the figurative vocabulary opened up by French and Italian sculptors of the later 18th and early 19th centuries. Francis Egerton, Earl of Ellesmere, who finally bought the Ino group in marble, shared with his brother, George Lewison Gore, later to become first Duke of Sutherland, a taste for contemporary art from mainland Europe. The pose of the youth testing the water with his extended toe, as if tempted to leave the pedestal, brings to mind the oft-reproduced bather by the 18th century French sculptor Etienne Maurice Falconet. Though Foley pushes the effect of attenuation still further with the arm raised behind the head, the hand clinging to a branch for support. More reminiscent of European models was the statue of Innocence, which Foley showed at the RA in 1839. Both this and the Youth at a Stream were chosen by the Art Union of London to reproduce as prizes in its lotteries. Innocence was reproduced for this purpose in Parian ware by the firm of Copeland, whilst the Youth, reduced using Benjamin Cheverton's patent machine, was cast as a bronze statuette by the founder A.J. Hatfield. The editor of the Art Union magazine, Samuel Carter Hall, later explained the art unions had been an attempt to kick-start the public's interest in sculpture, an interest which had proved up to then desultory. Foley himself had experienced difficulties over the sale of the Ino group, when a lukewarm patron had pulled out, forcing him to make a court appearance to justify retaining a down payment on the marble. It was not surprising, therefore, that he became a vocal supporter of the London Art Union when it found itself in dispute with the Board of Trade. He was one of those who, at a meeting on the 23rd of May, 1848, urged upon the whole body of artists the necessity of their united personal assistance to the Art Union Society, who could not be left alone to fight a battle in which the whole profession was more largely interested than the society itself. This was not the only occasion on which Foley was to demonstrate a disputatious streak. He was an elected associate of the Royal Academy in 1849 and a full academician in 1858. But from 1861, he declined to send his work to the annual exhibitions, owing to this dissatisfaction with the way his work had been shown. Foley's prize for his highly admired Westminster Hall exhibits in 1844 was a commission for 2 figures for St. Stephen's Hall in the Houses of Parliament, as rebuilt by Sir Charles Barry. They were of John Hampden and John Selden, and formed part of a series of figures of eminent parliamentarians from the 17th and 18th centuries. Foley showed these men as pillars of rectitude, both with a very strong vertical axis and in historical costume, though in neither case flamboyant. Hampden holds a sword to remind the viewer that he had died fighting on the side of Parliament in the Civil War, Selden with books and documents alluding to his legal learning, and a hand outstretched to emphasize the point. Benedict Reed, my court-old colleague, writing about the Hampden, detected in it the first signs of a naturalism which he claimed was to be the distinguishing feature of Foley's later career. He drew attention as an example of this to what he called Hampden's floppy-topped boots. These figures were chosen to represent the parliamentary cause in the absence of regicides, including Cromwell, who were not represented in the 19th century decor of the Palace of Westminster. The part played by John Hampden in the impeachment of the Earl of Strafford might have endeared him to an Irishman like Foley, but is hardly likely to have influenced the outcome. It is interesting that amongst the other figures in the series, the statue of the Irish patriot, Henry Grattan, was confided at a later stage to the Irish sculptor John Carew. I may be imagining this, but it does seem to me that Carew was motivated to produce the most stirring of these statues. I disagree on this point from Paula, who does not seem to have a high opinion of it, or thought it was lackluster in her Irish sculpture book. The question of genres, God, it's impossible, that word, came into focus with the Westminster Hall exhibition, where the prizes were commissions for figures from British history, although the entries were not all of that nature. In some of the resultant statuary, whose aim in most cases was to show character, there is what might be described as a non-idealizing approach. Hampden's floppy-top boots, for example, were probably intended to indicate the down-to-earth attitudes of the subject. Reed and others have pointed to Foley's mid-Victorian naturalism, and in the discourse of the time, the progress towards naturalism is recorded in a manner which to later viewers may seem like a question of mere niceties. Take, for example, the comparison which was made shortly after Foley's death by Cosmo Monkhouse between the Ino and Bacchus group and the slightly later group, Motherhood, which looked very much like a pendant to the earlier piece. According to Monkhouse, the second group represented a move away from mythological subject matter in the direction of a more universalist representation of the maternal principle. And it is probably true that the story behind the Ino group is one which only the most bookish would comprehend. Bacchus was the son of the god Zeus and the mortal woman Semele, who had made the mistake of demanding that the god Zeus, show himself to her in his divine form. The result of this, that she was burnt to death. The offspring of their union was the god of wine, who was brought up by his aunt, Ino. A lot of baggage, even though it is only the dangled grapes which give any indication of that backstory. According to Monkhouse, motherhood required no such esoteric preparation for its appreciation. Another big opportunity for British artists to show their worth was the decision to place statues in the niches of the so-called Egyptian Hall of London's Mansion House. This was the residence of the Lord Mayor, which had been built by George Dance in the 18th century. The niches of the Egyptian Hall had various temporary occupants over the years, but it was only in 1851 that a cultured common councilman called Francis Bennock had the inspired idea of filling them all with statues illustrating British history or British literature by, needless to say, British sculptors. Of the two statues contributed by Foley to this series, the second, representing Caractacus, was ostentatiously British, though it illustrated a passage from the annals of the Roman historian Tacitus, describing a rousing speech delivered to his followers by this opponent of Roman rule. To have shown Caractacus as a classical idealized male would have been defeating the object. Apart from the obligatory piece of drapery required in a hall where guests of both sexes were in the habit of congregating, the hero's identity is signalled by his battle axe and shield and by his hairstyle. It is from Julius Caesar that we learn that ancient Britons, apart from being painted with blue woad, shaved all of their bodies, except the tops of their heads and their moustaches, ending up looking pretty much like your average Victorian bourgeois. On the other hand, Foley's first contribution to the series, Egeria, was a subject from classical myth whose passport to the mansion house was the fact that she had figured in Lord Byron's poem Childe Harold's Pilgrimage. In this choice of subject, we may surmise that Foley was competing with his fellow Irishman Patrick MacDowell, who followed his own natural bent in opting for a female subject from Irish literature, Lee from Tom Moore's Lives of the Angels. Both were modern takes on Hellenistic Venuses. MacDowell, like Foley, was one of those successful Victorian sculptors who had not made the trip to Rome. Foley, when called upon by a commission appointed to give his opinion on the condition of the Royal Academy in 1863, said he thought a sculptor, in his words, would do very well to acquaint himself with all the best works of ancient and modern art, but felt that the finest examples of ancient art were in the British Museum anyway, in the form of the Elgin marbles. He was in favour of more travelling scholarships for sculptors, but believed that a travelling student, in his words, ought to have the option of studying in any of the principal continental schools to which his particular taste might lead him. This seems to indicate a quite eclectic attitude, though Foley, like most sculptors of his generation, were greatly under the sway of recent generations of sculptors in their lip service, if not total reverence for the classics. It was perhaps an event or a series of events which took place whilst the figure of Egeria was being completed between 1854 and 1857, which persuaded Foley to make his second Mansion House statue, the vociferously British Caractacus. The Duke of Wellington had died in September 1852 and 1854, when the government invited Foley, Edward Hodges Bailey, Carlo Marochetti, and John Gibson to provide designs for a monument to him in St. Paul's. A blank slide to indicate that we have no indication what Foley's entry looked like. Well, we do have a verbal description, as we'll see, but I thought it is one of the holes. There are the Shakespeare subjects and the Wellington projects, which are the major holes in our knowledge. I mean, now we have Charles Laws in the nude. That is really something, but we hope in the future to find some evidence of what those things look like. Probably they're under the underground somewhere near Dublin. Both Marochetti and Gibson declined to compete for Wellington's tomb, but Foley and Bailey both sent in 2 models each, all of which were turned down without reason given. And rumours arose that Marochetti, who had had the nerve to offer his services should the competition fail to produce a worthy design, would be given the job. Marochetti was indeed working on a huge and ambitious project. Even the announcement of an open competition in 1856 failed to quell these rumours, and Foley was among a large group of sculptors, including most of the eminent British sculptors of the day, signing a protest letter to the Chief Commissioner for Works, sent from what they referred to as the Sculptors' Institute, in which they pointed out that there was no dearth of British talents to equal those of Marochetti. They claimed that even in the days of such great sculptors as John Flaxman and Thomas Banks, the mediocre artists had been permitted to fill the Guildhall and St. Paul's with huge puerilities and distressing allegories. This reference to Flaxman and Banks interestingly shows us that these protesters were still looking back to the neoclassical period for exemplars. Unfortunately, as I say, no visual record of either of Foley's entries to the first Wellington competition has come down to us. But Foley actually exhibited one of them at the Royal Academy in 1854, and the Art Journal, in its review of that exhibition, gave a brief verbal description of it. And from the sound of this, it does seem that Foley was harking back to the earlier tombs of Napoleonic heroes in St. Paul's. It wrote, "In this design, Britannia crowns her hero, whose martial labours being concluded, he sheaths his sword. Below these figures is an exquisite group, illustrative of peace, which will be a noble work, life-size in marble. The whole composition is graceful and happily arranged in a pyramidal form." These words were preceded by the claim that there is nothing that proceeds from the studio of this artist that has not grace and beauty. As we know, the end result of the Wellington Tomb Saga was the equally controversial decision, after the judges had awarded prizes, to what they considered the front runners, to give the commission to Alfred Stevens, who had been one of several fifth prize winners. This decision was not taken on the grounds of sculptural quality, and indeed few at that time were aware of what Stevens might be capable of as a sculptor. The decision was taken on the grounds that it was more architecturally suited to the context of Rennes Cathedral than those of the more established sculptors. In 1861, Foley had a major row with the Royal Academy in London. This was over the conditions in which one of his works was displayed. The work in question was the action-packed relief of the storming of the Kashmir Bastion in Delhi. Do I have a picture of that? Yes, I do. Oh, yeah. During the Indian Uprising. This was to be the sculptural feature of a monument to Brigadier General John Nicholson, who had been killed in this engagement. It is easy to imagine how an insufficiently raking light may have been prejudicial to the reading of this busy image. Henceforth, Foley, who had been elected a full Royal Academician in 1858, declined to exhibit at the RA, though it was said that by the time of his death, good relations had been restored. Foley's other exhibit in 1861 was the bust of General James Outram, the one shown by Richard earlier. And in general, a falling off can be observed in Foley's production of imaginary and ideal sculpture from this point on. This was counterbalanced by a major escalation in commissions for public portrait statues, busts, and funerary monuments. In the commemorative statuary of the time, there was a predominant tendency towards naturalism. The public expected a likeness and wanted the subject to be shown as he, and except for the Queen, it always was a he, in those days, was normally seen. Fulfilling these expectations was facilitated, particularly when it came to recently dead subjects, by the availability of photographs of the subject, in addition to other aids such as painted portraits. If the public couldn't afford to buy photos of celebrities for their albums, wood engravings in the illustrated journals were often based closely on photos. Lived-in looking garments became increasingly acceptable in statuary, though certain boundaries tended not to be crossed. For example, top hats are almost never on, they are actually never on heads in statues. There was one statue in Glasgow by Marochetti in which the figure was holding a top hat in his hand, which has since been used by Glaswegian children as a kind of a target for pebbles thrown, see how many pebbles they could land in the upturned hat of the subject. Though these were very common, these hats were a common feature of male attire, and although painters like Frith in England, Menzel in Germany, and Manet in France were beginning to include them in urban scenes, their extreme rarity, even held in the hand, is indicative of moderation. Foley, without going out on a limb, followed the fashions to a great extent and produced some notable accounts of day-to-day clothing. In, for example, the statue of John Fielden in Todmorden in Yorkshire. As a radical reforming industrialist, any attempt to dress Fielden up might have looked inappropriate. Foley's chief rival in this field was Carlo Marochetti, who, despite his romantic beginnings, was by this time a dedicated realist when it came to putting contemporaries on plinths. Before what one might call the final reckoning, when Foley was called in to create the central figure of the Albert Memorial after Marochetti's death, there were two personalities of the day who they were both commissioned to sculpt. One was Colin Campbell, Lord Clyde, who Marochetti sculpted for London and Foley sculpted for Glasgow, and Sidney, Lord Herbert of Lee, who Marochetti sculpted for Salisbury and Foley sculpted for London. I have to say here that I find it particularly frustrating that contemporary commentators did not compare like with like by setting Foley's and Marochetti's treatments of Lord Clyde and Sidney Herbert off against each other. Though this is not to say that there is a dearth of commentary on any of these works. The curious thing is that, in the case of both subjects, we could be looking at quite different men. Marochetti was accused, probably rightly, of putting into 3 dimensions a portrait of Lord Clyde by Francis Grant. But I suspect that he would have used some of the photographic images of the subject, taken from many different angles, to assist in, in the conversion to 3 dimensions. He made no attempt to aggrandize the elderly and rather slight figure of the man, as he was in his later years. Indeed, it was stated at the time that Marochetti's Clyde was upstaged by the figure of a Victory, seated on a lion which fronts the cylindrical pedestal. Oh, I seem to have jumped there. Foley's modelling of the Clyde in Glasgow, on the other hand, is somewhat mellifluous compared to the dry precision of the Marochetti statue. Yes, I seem to have... yeah. Yes. Foley was accused of alluding to the subject's more recent Indian exploits through costume and accessories, but presenting an image of him which was 20 or so years younger than he had been during the Indian uprising. The sort of solecism which only contemporaries or people very familiar with Clyde's career would notice. The same reporter who pointed this out claimed that Foley's Clyde had a melodramatic, not to say bumptious, air about it, which is as alien to the highest class of art as it was to the character of the modest-minded soldier whose services it seeks to commemorate. In the case of Lord Herbert's statue, the one by Marochetti for Salisbury filled the subject's widow with apprehension. Without having seen the model, she expressed her concern about how it might turn out. I have found no record of her response to the finished statue, which gives a rather dry account of the subject, but one which is close to photographic images of the man who was said to have worn himself to death, sorting out the logistical nightmare of the Crimean campaign. The documents which Herbert holds in his right hand is the plan for Florence Nightingale's hospital at Scutari. After the unveiling, the Illustrated London News said of it that a more exemplary likeness could not be desired. Another paper said that it was a realistic work with no attempt at ideality. In the case of Lord Herbert, Foley seems to have decided to take a very different approach. He showed his subject in Pierre's robes and an ample cloak rather than everyday attire, looking downwards with one arm crossing his torso and his chin resting on his other hand. The Art Journal's critic considered that this represented the beginning of a new epoch in our street sculpture. The Athenaeum questioned whether Foley, with his cloak and robes, had not shirked seeking a solution of in quotes, a solution of those great modern problems in sculptural art, the introduction and noble treatment of apt costume. In this case, they're obviously thinking of contemporary costume. The same reviewer, however, compared the high quality of finish which had been given to the bronze with the showy, unfinished look of bronzes cast by Marochetti, who, of course, did his own founding in his Brompton foundry. These reviewers seem to have slightly missed the point of what Foley's statue was trying to say, and which would have come across better when it was standing as it originally did outside the old War Office. The pensive attitude and the reliefs seem to me to be a statement about modern wars, not necessarily being won by physical bravery in the field. The relief showing the casting of the Armstrong gun, which you've just seen on my last slides, at the Woolwich Arsenal, as well as being a pioneering representation of modern industry, emphasizes the importance of maintaining technically up-to-date munition supplies. The relief showing Florence Nightingale on the steps of the Herbert Hospital, so we do need to go back, don't we? Which is the one below there, in Woolwich, makes a point about army welfare and the services of women in war. In contrast to these, I am showing a rather poor image from Joseph Edgar Boehm's tomb of the Earl of Cardigan, a relief with the Earl ordering the quixotic charge of the Light Brigade earlier in the war, when the fabled 600 rode into the Valley of Death, their cavalry swords no protection against the Russian guns. With Marocchetti's death at the end of 1867, and the decision to entrust to Foley the principal figure of the Albert Memorial, it was as though Foley had come into his own. He had already been commissioned to sculpt the group of Asia for the memorial, a task in which he was given a chance to exhibit his skills in what would have been known as Orientalism, in which his naturalism was put to the test. This was an area in which the French had excelled. Busts of African subjects by Charles Cordier, shown at the Great Exhibition of 1851, had impressed the Queen sufficiently, persuading her to purchase a pair of them. Maybe it was Marochetti's French background which caused him to compete with Cordier in this area, first of all with busts of Indian favourites of the royal family. However, it was said that Foley had upstaged Marochetti while he was still living with a statue of a wealthy Bombay Parsi, who maybe not Menakji Nesawandji, as we learnt earlier from Richard, but Jahangir. Yes, hang on. I have a reference here to it having been exhibited in London in 1863, 1 year after Marochetti had shown his very heavy and static seated figure of Sir Jamsetji Jejeebhoy, that reference might actually help one to work out whether he is in fact Nesawandji or Jahangir. But I think we need all to look into that. It can at least be claimed for Marochetti that he was the first of a string of British sculptors to depict such wealthy Indians, initiating a series of memorable commemorations which, it seems to me, must have been inspired by a spirit of conciliation following the Indian uprising. Here I am aware that I may be trespassing on Richard's territory, but he doesn't seem to have said anything along those lines. Another topic on which I am tempted to trespass onto another speaker's territory is that of the equestrian statue, but there are strong arguments in support of my doing so. None of Foley's equestrian portraits were designed for English sites. However, both the Hardinge and the James Outram were exhibited in public spaces in London before being dispatched to India. The Lord Hardinge has come home to roost in a private collection following Indian independence, whilst the statue of Viscount Gough from Phoenix Park, after being blown off its pedestal by an IRA bomb of 1958, has been restored and now stands in the park at Chillingham Castle in Northumbria. Sorry, repeating what everybody else has said. This was an area in which Foley could not have avoided seeing himself and being judged in relation to Marochetti. Of course, in an English context, the Marochetti equestrian statue which comes to mind is the somewhat theatrical Richard Coeur de Lion, shown in plaster at the Great Exhibition and finally erected in bronze in Old Palace Yard, Westminster in 1860. However, it must be remembered that between 1840 and 1844, Marochetti had sculpted an equestrian statue of the Duke of Wellington for Glasgow, a statue in which the horse is static, all hoofs on the ground, in the manner of Sir Francis Chantry. Foley also explored the gamut of possibilities, going still further than Marochetti and portraying vivid action. At the static end of the spectrum is his Viscount Canning for Kolkata. This posture was a more appropriate one for a diplomat and colonial administrator than for a soldier. At the other extreme is the astonishing statue of Major General Sir James Outram, inaugurated in Calcutta in 1874. In terms of 19th century sculptural aesthetics, Foley may be said to have gone out on a limb with the daring pose of his Outram. In the early years of the century, we find the French art pundit, Quatremer de Quincy, reprimanding the Italian sculptor Antonio Canova for having created an equestrian statue of Napoleon in which the emperor looks back to encourage his troops. Closer to the date of Outram, Marochetti is said to have replied to a suggestion by a Piedmontese courtier that King Carlo Alberto of Savoy should be depicted in this manner. He was holding up a flag, I think, and beckoning on his troops. But to this, Marochetti is supposed to have answered, "Ma como è ciò possibile in statuaria?" In other words, how can that be done in statuary? Suggesting that such a thing, though possible in a painting by Géricault, was not appropriate to three-dimensional monumental art. Instead, he stuck to his guns in the somewhat stiff statue finally erected in Turin. Foley showed with the Outram that such a pose could be managed successfully, even with the horse going at full belt. According to a just posthumous report in an Irish journal, it took him 12 years and many changes of mind before he did so. From the back, Outram looks more like some action-packed subject piece, as Richard has already pointed out, than a commemorative portrait statue. Interestingly, reading the newspaper accounts of the famous libel case of Belt v. Laws, I find that amongst the works left unfinished, amongst the works left unfinished in Foley's studio at his death was just such a subject, called A Moment of Peril, in which a mounted American Indian attempts to ward off a large snake. This work, now in Leighton House in London, was finished by Thomas Brock and was exhibited as a work by Brock rather than Foley. This suggests to me that at the time of Foley's death, it was little more than a sketch. Brock was to go on to make his own contribution to this backward-looking mode of equestrian statuary, with the statue of Maharaja Jang Bahadur, erected in Kathmandu in Nepal in 1885, which you have there on the left. And on the right, I'm showing a statue by Raffaele Romanelli of Garibaldi in Siena, which quite clearly indicates that Romanelli had seen possibly illustrations of the Outram in an illustrated journal. It seems to me that a question mark still hangs over the portrait of Albert on the Albert Memorial. When the Queen was called upon to pass judgment on Marochetti's final proposal, although she judged that the statue as a whole would not do, she did suggest that Marochetti's head be retained and incorporated in any new statue. We also know from the documents that Foley did indeed take away the head of Marochetti's statue. It remains open to question whether he in fact used it, or did he quietly do the whole figure from scratch and following his own bent. He had, after all, by that time created figures of the Prince for Cambridge, Birmingham, and Dublin, which had met with the Queen's approval. So it seems to me probable that apart from any touches that might have been given to it immediately prior to the casting by Thomas Brock, that the work is Foley's own in its entirety. I would add that Foley had gone some way to endear himself with the monarch. By this time, to such an extent that she would have been unlikely to insist on his following her advice. Apart from the other statues of Albert and the group of Asia, all of which had convinced her that Foley was, in her own words, a man of much talent, she was much impressed by Foley's memorial to Major General Robert Bruce, a memorial which must have been very close to her heart. Bruce was the brother of a long-term lady-in-waiting to the Queen, Lady Augusta Stanley, and he had accompanied the Prince of Wales on a trip to Palestine, during which he contracted the illness which was to kill him. The reliefs on the tomb chests, of which I unfortunately do not have close-up photos, it'd be amazing to get pictures of those 3 marble reliefs. They look very, very interesting. The reliefs on the tomb chest show incidents from the trip, one of which shows Bertie ministering to his sick tutor, an act of charity by the more often recalcitrant and disappointing heirs to the throne. On the memorial, Bruce's effigy has crossed legs in the manner of Crusader tombs, while at his head, a veiled female weeps over him. Not surprisingly, the Queen found this memorial most beautiful. It is plain enough from a very extensive and varied oeuvre that Foley made a major mark in British sculptural history, even though his achievement is difficult to define in a few words. Elements of neoclassicism persist in some funerary monuments and in an ideal figure like the Egeria. However, Foley was anything but a textbook classicist. He was vocal in his resistance to the dependency on antique models and insistent on the desirability of a wider range of eclecticism, including work from the Renaissance and more modern times. The controversy over whether he can be considered as a major influence on the late 19th century phenomenon known as the New Sculpture. A lot of historians of the New Sculpture have made a case for this, although one of the chief historians of the New Sculpture did not include him, said that he was, he represented the kind of sculpture against which these symbolist new sculptors were revolting. But to me, it seems really neither here nor there. I mean, I think we should judge him by the standards of his time. His work, though often staid and respectable, can also be on occasion surprisingly novel and inventive, and overall gives significant expression to a mid-Victorian worldview.